Hello and welcome everyone to the SSH, a deep dive into the anatomy of a secure shell audit. We are now about to begin the webinar, and for all listening, you are in listen-only mode. During the presentation, we do ask if you have any questions, so please use the chat feature, and we will try to address those questions at the end of the presentation, time permitting. So first and foremost, again, welcome everyone, and my name is Ruben Rodriguez, Director of Marketing, and I would like to thank you for joining us today to discuss what we here at SSH Communications like to call the secure shell of things, which, when you boil it down to its most simple form, is how your networks are exchanging data to what we all hope and strive to be the most secure channel as possible. Given the growth and expansion of networks, their overall complexity expands with the number of connection points and the devices continuously changing. To add to the complexity, many of the connections are automated and in some cases haven't been properly updated in some time with new credentials and keys. To help you get a handle on how you can best manage your IT network and how you can address an audit, SSH is here to discuss with you how you can get control of your IT environments and ensure your data is protected. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Joe Scaff, Director of Global Customer Services here at SSH. Joe is responsible for managing global technical sales, support, professional services, and customer projects. He brings an extensive amount of first-hand knowledge with over 12 years of experience, and 8 years of those focused solely on the information security and network communications industry. He has helped numerous customers within various verticals spanning financial services, government, healthcare, and utilities, just to name a few. During today's webinar, Joe will talk to you about the anatomy of a secure shell audit with real-life case studies focusing in on secure shell risks, how you can get a handle on the current state of your environment with analysis you can use to make proper assessments, and what is needed to address compliance requirements from an IT or audit perspective. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Joe, and Joe, please take it away.
Thank you, Ruben. And again, welcome everyone to the webinar. We'll jump right into the agenda, go over quickly just what we're going to be talking about, or how the presentation will be structured. As Ruben mentioned, all of those things will be covered within the 2 case studies in the compliance section that we have listed here. But first, I'd like to go over an overview of some of the things that we've seen within the customers that we work with or organizations that we've worked with, and also some of the terminology that we'll be talking about throughout the case study slides. And then, of course, ending, we'll go through the 2 case studies. One is for a bank in Europe and another one an energy company in Germany. And then finally, we'll go over 2 compliance regulations, PCI and NIST for the government, and how those relate to SSH and the key usage and authentications that SSH provides. First slide I want to go through is what we've seen in organizations. So most organizations have compliance and regulations around or centralized management around 20% of their identities that use SSH or SSH key authentications. The other 80%, what we found, don't have any regulations around them and what they're being used for. In many cases, these are machine-to-machine authentications or automated processes that, even though there's not necessarily an interactive user that's using those, it's still a possible attack vector, because those authentications, even though their intentions may not be as interactive users, could still be used as an interactive authentication into machines. And you also, with some of the viruses and things that are out there, like the mask that some of you may have heard of, those authentications can be leveraged in viruses and applications that might be meant for malicious intent. What we found is there is a knowledge gap between customers and what they know is out there in their SSH environment. So who has access to secure shell, who is using those authentications, and how many actual authorized users they have using SSH. And in many cases, there's users out there that a company may not be aware of that actually have access, or they may not be aware that they're able to access a machine using SSH because the intention of that user account may not have originally been for an SSH-based connection. What versions are active? So this is very important. Again, some of the security risks, that security announcements that have come out. You want to be up to date on your software. You want to be, especially in SSH, something that provides access. If you're using older versions of SSH client and server, the versions could possibly be compromised with security vulnerabilities. Another thing that we'll talk a lot about today is which keys and servers pose the greatest risk. Many companies have heard of that, are aware of the PCI environment, something that definitely needs to be secured. But there's also transaction-based machines that can cause, if those connections go down, either for malicious reasons or non-malicious reasons, or the connections between those machines go down, it can mean thousands or more like millions of dollars in many financial organizations that of loss for those companies just for minutes worth of downtime for that particular transaction to occur. And the third thing we'll talk about in compliance is where will they fail in an audit if a company gets audited. Next, I want to go through a couple terms that we'll be using throughout the presentation. One is separation of duties. So as you can see in this diagram, each node here represents a server, and the arrows are connections between those servers. And separation of duties is something that shows up in any one of the compliance mandates, whether it's PCI, HIPAA, NIST, SOX, things like that. So you have to separate your development machines from connected to your production machines. I was actually in a scenario or working with a customer a couple of years ago where that was their main mandate. They had failed a mass audit because they had developed machines putting incorrect data, test data, into a production machine and caused, again, a huge amount of financial loss to that company. The next thing that a lot of customers and companies don't think about is the transit of trust. So how those trusts can propagate from machine to machine to machine, and how those machines and those connections within those machines will provide access out to other machines. This is a scenario where about 50 machines, and this is a real life use case, 50 machines approximately have connection into one single host. And many customers say, well, I need to protect those 50 machines if I want to protect that end host. But that's not necessarily good enough. In some ways, if one of those hosts is compromised, you may not know that if you go a second level, so what machines can actually connect to those other 50 machines. And this is what we got from one of our scans that we provided to a customer. So that ballooned out once we just went 2 levels, and you can imagine if you start going 3 levels or 4 levels. And what this is showing is that that single machine sitting out there on the left is not only accessible from those 50 machines, but also from many machines outside of that. If you're blocking one machine from accessing that end host, it doesn't mean that they can't then propagate to another machine that then does have access to the end host. So it's very important to be able to scan and recognize that the problem can be outside of just a single machine-to-machine trust. You have to look beyond it, and that's we'll go over another scenario in one of our use cases in a few minutes. So now I just want to go through the process that we do at SSH as far as if a customer comes to us and asks us to look at their secure shell environment and find any risk, anything that they might fail an audit for, or that might just potentially be, they might just be looking at it from a security standpoint, which is always great when you hear companies that being more proactive and not just looking at it before they or after they failed an audit. So we broken it down into 3 phases essentially. Interview process, very important. We need to know what your current processes, policies, and the scope of the scan is going to be. Many customers we found don't have processes and policies around, and we'll discuss that in just a minute as well. And then we do a scan. So we have tools built in, and all the diagrams that you're seeing in the presentation are built by our tools because it gives a good representation of the complexity that we have to deal with and how to get a handle on that complexity. Excuse me. So we scan for configurations because in many cases companies don't have standard configurations and they allow root directly into the boxes and things like that when in their policies, they may say we don't allow root authentication. So it's very important to scan the SSH server configurations at that point. We already mentioned the software. You want to make sure that you're up to date on the software, make sure that it doesn't have a security vulnerability in any of the versions that you're using for your critical systems. And of course, as I mentioned, the keys, the authorizations, what gives you access to those servers. And then we compile it into a report. We highlight any risks. We go through, depending on the compliance mandates that a particular company is interested in, and we map them to those particular PCI, for instance, PCI in the case coming up in the bank, that map those to those PCI things so that they can know what things they need to change in order to be PCI compliant or HIPAA compliant or whatever the regulation might be. And of course offer our recommendations as far as this. All right, so let's get into the case studies. First one is the bank, and this one will go into a little bit more detail as far as the whole process, and then the energy based case, the energy company based case study. We'll pull out a few items that we didn't necessarily find in the bank so that we can show you some of the different scenarios that we find. In this case, we interviewed the head of Unix infrastructure and the senior system administrator. And by the way, it's pretty clear, but we made it so that you're not aware of the actual company and the actual names of those users and things like that, and the server names in these diagrams. But the key findings in the interview process is that they have no mention of SSH configuration or keys that are used for authentication in their access management and security policies. We've seen that with a lot of companies, and not just banking companies, retail companies, et cetera. And the second item, no process or tools used to manage or monitor key-based access. So many people have that top 20%, and they might be monitoring the password usage or things like that. They rotate the passwords, but there's no management or monitoring on the keys themselves, which also provides some of the same access that you might see in a standard password-based authentication. In this case, we actually found insecure protocols were used in the bank, and specifically FTP. Now, I don't know if that was critical information, but in your case, a username and password is going over clear text every time that you use an FTP. And this bank is not the only customer that we found this, and so it is out there. It is something that should be cleaned up. And there's no monitoring in place for privileged users. Some of you may have heard of HostGator scenario where a privileged user gained access to, I believe it was 2,000 plus machines because he had privileged user rights, and he was, I think, let go and still had the access, and potentially that could happen to any number of companies. So you have to be able to monitor and see what the access of those privileged users have. And without all that, without the policies, without the monitoring and management, this is what you get. You get a lot of trust relations that are intermingled. It looks like it's one solid blob there in the middle, but those are actually vectors and connections between servers and hosts. This is just 582 servers. Server platform included development and production functions, application servers, database servers, data warehouse servers, and it was multiple data centers across 3 different cities. And I'll quickly go to the next slide and dive into some of the additional details. So a total of a little over 1,600 user accounts have SSH keys. There's obviously other user accounts in this scenario, but that we found SSH keys. 740 private keys. These are the keys that you keep locally on your system, and then the public keys are then distributed publicly, obviously. And so that amounted to just over 4,000 authorized keys. Again, the public keys are also authorized keys. 23% of the private keys were unknown. So that means out of the selected number of servers that we scanned, 23% of the public keys that we found, we didn't know what the private keys were. So they could be sitting on someone's USB stick ready to be used as an attack vector. It could be a server that we just didn't scan. It could be an outside connection. We don't know. But that's something that shows that we need to actually be able to find out what that information is. And 35 shared private keys. That's actually not that bad. But anytime you share a private key, there's a risk that that private key is compromised. So in most cases, you keep the private key local on your system. If that private key was transferred to one of the other, another server, you don't know whether it was sent by email or an unsecured manner that causes someone else to be able to grab that key and use it. So we don't recommend sharing private keys unless it's possibly in a high availability situation where you need to make sure that the keys are exactly the same. And 6 private keys were passphrase protected. For those that may not know, when you passphrase protect a private key, that means that you have to put in a PIN or a password, well, a passphrase essentially, in order to unlock that private key for usage. And the fact that only 6 of those were protected in that way is a little bit scary. It's something to consider in protecting those keys down the road. Key age, very important. We talked about how the passwords are managed, essentially managed that top 20% of the iceberg, or the tip of the iceberg. And one of the ways that you manage passwords is that you make people rotate. You make people change their password on a regular basis. There's not the same functionality in many companies for keys, which also provide authentication into a system. So we found that over 40% of keys were over 2 years old. Again, you probably have a policy in place that every 6 months or maybe even as long as a year, you have to rotate your passwords. Many companies don't have that policy related to keys. 40% of the keys on the next diagram below are against the recommended security practice. So as you can see, there's some keys that are outside of this particular company's policy using 1024 or lower keys, and not it looks like probably based on the diagram that the 2048 RSA is their standard key, but they still have some keys outside of that range, which could be a concern as well. Again, summarize some of the scan results and point to some other things. You'll see the diagram on the left hand here is showing you the separation of duties, which we explained briefly in the beginning, where you have connections coming from non-production machines to production machines, whether it's a QA, a DR, a development machine, or possibly unknown machines as well. And all those connections are intermingled, and you see this web of mess. It's essentially a web of connections that, as you can see, it would be very hard to manage using some kind of manual process. And we can help you in identifying where there's some gaps and things of that sort. On the right-hand side, we show authorizations to root. Of course, as a security company, we recommend you don't actually allow direct root access to servers. Many organizations still do that, but we recommend you give access and then you allow them to SU to root if they need to do a root-based function. This diagram shows the number of connections that they have still currently that have root level access into those machines directly. So in summary, the analysis of this banking company, we call it XYZ, revealed 6 high-risk issues and 14 PCI DSS compliant violations. We don't have it in a slide. If you ask us, we probably can provide you a scrubbed version of those PCI violations that were found. And certainly if you have questions, we can follow up later on what your specific concerns might be as well. But that concludes our assessment report for this particular banking case study. And we'll move on to the energy-based case study. Excuse me. And again, you see in this scenario as well that there is a pretty big blob or a mess of connections to many servers. In this case, we had just over 9,000 connections using SSH keys. And again, every line here that kind of either the dark area or the red area represents a connection using a private and public key. Red lines, of course, are the connections that are unknown, as we discussed further, where we don't actually know where the private key is coming from. Oops. Sorry, one sec. There we go. Got hung up. And here's another good example of separation of duties for this particular company, showing specifically just root authorizations going from development to production. You see the larger orbs there are the development servers and the connections. Sorry, the organizations at the top of the development connections coming in and being able to connect to production. And this is again just a diagram showing another scenario, in this case for this energy company, where we have a clear separation of duties violation. And circumventing a jump host. So many of you probably have heard of jump hosts. Many of you use jump hosts. And in a scenario that, again, 2 years ago, one of the other large banks that we've worked with they were using PowerBroker. But it's very easy once you got PowerBroker access into an end server, in this case, in this diagram, a Unix server. You could then bypass that by setting a key up on that end host, and I could directly connect from my laptop into that Unix server. I never did that, but I could have. And that was one of the scenarios that they wanted to fix. And so this is something that is very important in being able to identify those connections that are coming or possibly circumventing the jump host scenario, because then you will lose your tracking of that connection, and if they circumvent the jump host, unless you have some other measures in place that we can talk about. And for the energy case study, you can see here that in those servers in the middle are their jump host, and you can see that there's a number of servers connecting back and forth from those machines. But you can, well, it's a little bit difficult to see, but you can also see that many of these servers are coming from, many of the connections onto that are going to those larger orbs at the top right have connections in from unknown hosts. So that means that there is some server circumventing that jump host, and it could be a machine-to-machine connection, but the risk is there. You don't know in this case. We'll have to do additional work or scan additional servers in order to determine that. So I like this diagram just because it shows that, again, more the complexity, but also shows that jump host scenario can also be circumvented, and it's something that we need to look at very carefully. Okay, so again, we're not going into as much details here, but let's go into a summary. So some of the consequences for this company and some of the things that we found is which systems an administrator, something that they weren't aware of and they couldn't tell us, is which system an administrator should be allowed to access. Again, very common theme with almost everybody we talk to. If contractual agreements have been violated, again, this is energy company, have contracts, things like that, so they're not able to tell us whether someone is logged in, there's not monitoring in place, they haven't been able to tell us whether there was someone that logged in and possibly pulled contractual information off of their networks. Which sensitive data has really been accessed? Again, same thing. If the compliance requirements were fulfilled, and again, we help these companies, we don't have it in this particular slide deck, but we help these companies map up, PCI regulations with some of the issues that we found in the scan, and what their admin actually did, internal as well as external. The external is a bit scary there, but again, that goes back to bullet number 2 and 3. There's no monitoring in place in those authentications have been used and what is being done when those authentications are being used. Our recommendations for immediate action for this particular company in this scenario: create an enterprise-wide SSH policy. I would like to repeat that, but that is one of the biggest things that we found, that the companies aren't aware of the risk, and that's partly why we do these webinars, so we can hopefully show that there is risk there and that we need to educate companies around policies. We certainly will offer recommendations. We can do these scans for you, things like that. The next bullet point is key remediation with considerations on current usage. Again, that presents a bit of a problem because they're not sure we just saw the slide before. They're not sure what the usage of their keys are currently. I mean, again, we could provide them a snapshot at the moment, but they need to get a bigger handle on that or a tighter handle on that, and then remediate those keys, remove keys that aren't being used, remove the keys that are going from development to production and things of that sort. Excuse me. Relocate the remaining SSH keys to root-owned read-only paths. This is something we didn't actually talk about in the beginning, but I'll explain it pretty quickly here. In current scenarios, part of the reason that all these companies have this mess of keys and this large amount of keys that are kind of somewhat uncontrolled is that any user that has access to the machine can add a new key to their server. You need the jump host scenario. I get access to my account on the jump host. I'm not a root user, but I can add a new public key to that server and gain access from another machine without anyone knowing, because, as we mentioned many times, there's no monitoring in many cases of what's being used in SSH or through those SSH connections. So what we have recommended our customers and done in many cases is had them relocate their keys that are stored in their individual users' home directories and store them on the same server, but in a root-owned location. So only root or privileged users are able to update those keys and be able to add new keys. It kind of, in some ways, to use a term that we use in one of the other, the banking scenario that I worked on 2 years ago, we stopped the bleeding. We stopped, and that's very important because then we can allow for the remediation process to start without constantly trying to hit a moving target. And the last item there, preparation for traceability, especially of privileged users, according to PCI DSS requirements. And that, again, we can, we're going to go over the compliance regulations in just a bit. So this is just an overview of what we covered. This has nothing to do with the particular use case that we discussed here, but some interesting facts that we've uncovered. 90% of the time, SSH credentials used to authenticate are not properly managed. In many cases, those are SSH keys. The average one unknown root key for every 10 servers. That's a bit scary. It means 1 out of 10 servers has a key sitting on it that allows for someone to log in as root to that server without us knowing where the initiating side is or the client side is. Up to 90% of the keys are inactive or redundant. Again, someone gets their private key, they leave the company, and that key is never, the public key or the authorized key is never removed. It's just sitting out there for years and years, and possibly an attack vector if that private key is still sitting on someone's computer or USB device or anything that could store a private key. And frequent access to production environment with unknown keys. Again, it is difficult to find all the keys out there, all the private keys, but certainly we can do monitoring in a way that will allow us to, over some period of time, to determine exactly if those keys are needed, and we can help you with removing those. Okay, so on to the compliance requirements, and just want to go over briefly, many of, if not all of these compliance requirements kind of go by the same kind of, I don't know if life cycle is the right word, but they touch on different points, I guess. So continuous monitoring, life cycle authorizations for key or passwords and the management of that, access controls and configuration controls. And SSH sits directly in the middle of all that because there's SSH configurations. We allow for authentication, so that needs to be managed. It's an encrypted protocol, so continuous monitoring is very difficult with whenever you have an encrypted protocol and the data going over encrypted. But again, we could help you with that as well. And access controls, of course, as well. And it's covered across all of the compliance regulations, and I'm sure there's some that are not listed here, but of course PCI, HIPAA, NIST, COBOL, MAS, to name a few. And I won't go over all these because then it will be very boring, but some things to highlight. specifically on one of the PCI DSS related to secure shell document process. We talk about policies and procedures, and many companies not having those controls and management of SSH users and host keys. We didn't talk much about host keys, but we'll do that at a different presentation. Ensure only secure versions of SSH are deployed. Very important from a PCI DSS compliance mandate. Implement strong access control measures. Review onboard, offboarding, and governance procedures over SSH authorized access, both interactive and automated use. So again, just like with passwords, anytime you provision a user account, in this case you provision a key or an authorization, there needs to be governance around that so that you know who has access to what and how that process and procedure works for removing that access once a user leaves the company or whatever it might be, the process is no longer used. And then moving on to NIST, again, there's more details, of course, but we're only going to go over a few of the PCI and NIST-based requirements and compliance requirements. But NIST, just like PCI, is guidance. It doesn't actually tell you exactly how to clean up your keys necessarily, or what the appropriate rotation procedure is and things like that. That's up for each company or to figure out on their own what then kind of meets those compliances is up for interpretation. But of course we're showing what we interpret those compliance regulations to be. So access controls, policy-based lifecycle management for SSH keys. Again, it's a bit repetitive, but I want to make sure that everybody leaves here with that embedded in their head. Audit and accountability. Key usage must be audited. So just like we mentioned with PCI DSS. Configuration management. SSH configurator must be under change management's control. If there's a change made, if root is allowed on that configuration, but using that configuration, then it might violate separation of duties, it might violate access rights, it might violate anything. So the change management needs to have control over what changes are actually being made on those environments. Maintenance. Continuing monitoring of SSH keys and software is what we list that as. You need to know what authentications are being added, what authentications are being removed, what are out there, and what data is going in between those secure channels. Again, like I mentioned, it's hard to actually see what the data is going over the secure channel or encrypted networks without some kind of special monitoring tool in place. And in part, to close out, just tell you a bit about who we are, SSH. We are the inventors of the SSH Secure Shell Protocol. Authors and contributors of over 90 RFCs. We're publicly listed on the Helsinki NASDAQ. Work with very large companies, both small and large, trusted experts. We have 3 offices across the world, Helsinki, Boston, and Hong Kong. Over 3,000 customers, 7 out of 10 top Fortune 500, 40% of the Fortune 500, and more than half of the top U.S. banks. And that's pretty much the end of the presentation. I did want to mention that we are going to be at RSA, and we invite anybody that's going to be at RSA to join us. And we also will have a newer version of our HealthCheck tool available for demo at RSA.